Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 19. I Can't Do That. Pedo walked into his office and stopped abruptly. So you are here. Sakal said she thought she saw you slip into the house, but I couldn't figure out what would bring you over here so early. Shem looked up from Pedo's desk. I'm sorry, I didn't want to wake you, but I needed to check your numbers. Pedo sat in a chair on the other side of the desk. What's mine is yours, Shem. You know that. The way of Salem. I'm glad you feel that way, Shem said, the corner of his mouth going up. Just remember that. So what numbers are you looking for? Shem held up some pages. The totals from the storehouses, how much we have in long-term storage. These are the most recent figures, right? Pedo nodded. That's the copy everyone at the council meeting got last night. We're doing well with distribution. There are still a few panicked individuals here and there, a few nervous about the food running out, but we have enough for over 4 years and no one will even lose weight. And Shem, Pedo leaned closer. I have to agree with the scientists at the council. The world is getting colder. Already the ponds and lakes have ice thicker than ever recorded for this time of year. And it's only the 43rd day of harvest. With the sun not burning through the haze, and if this cold lasts, we might not warm up enough for a planting or weeding season next year. The eruption may have permanently chilled the world. Shem nodded soberly as he looked at the page. I know. You should, Pedo smirked at him. You're the one who compiled those numbers with the scientists to distribute to the council. So I wonder, why are you here reading my copy? Shem dropped the page guiltily and leaned back. Because I wonder, Pedo, if this food is really meant just for us. Pedo tipped his head. What are you talking about? I woke up early this morning from an unusual dream, Shem said quietly. At the end of it, I saw myself figuring out the surviving population of the world. The world? Pedo exclaimed. Why? Do you realize that at our current distribution rate, there's enough reserves to feed 560,000 people for 1 year? Pedo narrowed his eyes. Go on, he said, a little coldly. Shem picked up a sheet full of calculations he'd made. I've been doing some figuring based on what villages we think were destroyed by the volcano and at what rates the pox may have killed off the world's population. My last estimate of their population was around 920,000, considering the reduction during the past 2 decades since so few babies are being born. But if villages along the Idamir River are gone, he continued, and Pedo began to squint more fiercely, which is about 140,000 people, and if the pox eliminated 1/3 of the survivors, I have an estimate of how many people are left. He held up the paper, 515,000. Pedo's eyebrows shot up. Their population is nearly cut in half. Shem nodded gravely. And we're down to 110,000. But Pedo, if we were to cut back just a little, so that no one would really miss it, look how many people we could feed for an entire year. He held up another paper, 625,000. Pedo couldn't believe what Shem was suggesting. You want us to feed the entire world? Well, we could for a year. Pedo stood up. Why? He exclaimed angrily. Do you know how hard we worked to plant extra crops, build enormous storehouses, develop ways to keep the food preserved, and now you want to just give it to those who've done nothing to deserve it? Shem rocked back in surprise. What's mine is yours, Salem's way, remember? Nothing to deserve it? Pedo, what do you deserve? Pedo stepped awkwardly. What do I deserve? When we brought you here when you were 17 years old, what had you done for Salem then? Pato sighed resignedly, already seeing the direction of the conversation. Nothing. And what did we give you? Everything. Did you deserve that? No, Pato admitted. But we gave it to you anyway, right? Because who gave it all to us, as undeserving as we all are? The Creator, Pato mumbled. Shem cocked his head. What was that again, Rector Shin? Pato managed an embarrassed smile. The Creator, Guide Zenas. That's right. Pato sat back down, disheartened. Feed the world, Shem. Guide. I must confess that's not an option I ever considered. The guide sighed. Nor I, Rector. I don't know if we will, but it's important to know that we could, and that we make it available. Pato stared at the desk until he remembered. You mentioned that a dream brought you here. May I know what it was? I've never heard you talk of a specific dream before. I haven't, Pato, Shem said. Usually inspiration comes to me as images in my mind. I see what's happening somewhere, or an action I should be taking. But a vivid dream? He smiled. It was wonderful. Oh, Pato, I really wished you could have seen it. Pato leaned forward. So, can you tell me? Should I record this? I know I'm not an assistant, but... Probably don't record it, Shem said uncomfortably. It wasn't exactly, well, I don't know, really. Pato frowned at his odd reluctance. Tell me what you saw. Shem sighed. Oh, it was short, far too short. I wept when I woke up to realize it was already over and he was gone. Pato was on the edge of his seat. Was he the Creator? Shem smiled faintly. No, not last night. But Pato, it was your father, Perrin. Really? He breathed. How did he look? Fantastic, Shem grinned. He was in his colonel's uniform and he looked as he did in his 40s. I never realized before how much you resemble him at that age. Same face, just different build. I always thought when he was the colonel, that was when he was the most impressive. So? Pato motioned eagerly. Go on. Well, suddenly, there he was, Shem related, in full uniform, shaking me by the shoulder to wake me in my dream. And he said, Hey, Shem, we've stored enough to feed the entire world for a year, right? And I said, well, I'm not sure, but probably. I'd have to run some numbers, but Perrin, why? Then he was gone, and I saw myself sitting at your desk looking at these papers. Pato tipped his head in disappointment. Hey, Shem, not exactly some kind of prophetic vision I'd expect for the guide. Perrin shrugged. Well, that's how Perrin was. Is. Pato began to smirk. You're right. I didn't need to write it down. Hey, Shem, Pato said, lowering his voice to sound remarkably like his father. Inquired the general, how much elk jerky is in the barrels? Shem chuckled. All right. You asked and I told you. He sat back and looked thoughtfully at the wall. But it did get me thinking. And you have to admit the numbers are intriguing. Why didn't he come to me? Pato wondered. I did take over his job. I'm now in charge of securing Salem and am part of the council over the storehouses. Shem cleared his throat. And how did you first react when I suggested we feed the world? Pato winced guiltily. I see your point. Maybe if he came to me, we could have had a lively argument for a few minutes. Shem shook his head. He didn't seem to have much time, only seconds. And you wouldn't have argued with him about the supplies. You would have been asking him about young Pear. He didn't have that kind of time. Pato looked down at his hands. Well, at least you got to see him, to know he's still out there. Shem smiled. He is. It really was him, coming to plant an idea in my mind. Pato sighed. So what do we do, Guide Zenas? Wait for Lemuel to send a messenger asking if he can borrow a cup of flour? Or do we go down and offer it, Rector Shin? The lieutenant enjoyed the quiet breakfast at the table. In honor of the general's arrival, the spread was as grand as usual. The lieutenant felt only a little guilty for indulging himself, remembering that the leftovers would go to the staff. Even though the sun was rising in the hazy sky, he was the only one up. Slither had stayed up late, trying to explain passages of the writings to Guide Lannard, his eyes going glassier the later it became. When they went to bed, Guide Lannard was in a daze. The lieutenant heard the major's familiar steps coming to the eating room, and they stopped when he saw the lieutenant already at the table. Slagging Zenuses, Croup hissed under his breath. The lieutenant pretended not to hear, but stood up and saluted. Croup sighed and saluted back. Didn't think anyone else would be up this early, he said, as he took a seat as far away as he could. The lieutenant shrugged. I was awoken early this morning and couldn't get back to sleep. Croup rubbed his eyes. Never had such a hard time sleeping here before. Then again, there wasn't any meat or interesting company last night. He reached for a bowl of porridge. I imagine you have a great deal on your mind, the lieutenant said helpfully. Croup grunted and took a small green apple from a bowl of underripe fruit. When do you think you'll be leaving for Idemia? The lieutenant tried again. No idea. Well, if I don't see you before then, I wish you a good journey. Croup finally looked up at him. You're not going? It's best if I stay here and continue my studies with Professor Slither, the lieutenant said. As soon as Varys and Onus are apprehended, I'll return to the command tower. Someone will need to take over your duties. Exactly what are your duties, sir? So you're not going. Croup almost smiled. Sure, you can take over some of my duties. Twig can fill you in. Mostly has to do with supplies, anyway. But you already know all about that, he added quietly. Mari heard the knock on her gathering room door and opened it. Shem? I hope I didn't wake you, he said apologetically. Not at all. Come in, she said, gesturing for him to sit. I'm only staying a minute, Mari, he said, as he sat down in Perrin's large chair. Immediately he stood back up and gave Mari another remorseful look. She waved it off. Sit, Shem, he's not going to mind. He's not here anyway, she added quietly. Shem took her by the shoulders. That's what I'm here to tell you. He was, briefly, during the night. What? He came to me in a dream, just for a few seconds, then he had to rush off again. About young Pear? Mari's eyes lit up. No, I'm sorry. He wanted to know if we had enough food stored to feed the world. Mari's eyes grew large. Really? And? He already knew the numbers himself, I'm sure. He was just there to put the idea in my mind. Then he smiled slyly. But by the expression on your face, your initial reaction is the same as your son's. Mari stiffened. We feed the world, she said through gritted teeth. Yep, Shem nodded. He's your son, all right. Look, I don't know if anything will come of it, but that's not the main reason I came to see you. I thought you'd want to know about Perrin. Immediately, Mari's eyes brightened again. Yes, I do. How did he look? Shem grinned. Wonderful, just as he did when he was the colonel. Now that I think about it, he appeared exactly as those in the world would have remembered him. I have a feeling someone down there had a disturbing dream last night. I wonder if it was Lemuel, he added wistfully. Mari grinned. So he seemed happy? He was perfect, Mari, but he had only seconds. That's as long as I saw him, or I'm sure he would have come by to give you a kiss." Mari's eyes bubbled with tears. "Thank you, Shem," she whispered. "If he comes again, will you tell him it takes only a second to give me a kiss?" Shem raised an eyebrow. "Perrin? Take only a second to kiss you?" He chuckled. "Not the Perrin I know." The lieutenant was just about to get up from the table when a haggard General Thorne stumbled into the eating room. He slumped into a chair at the head and propped up his head in his good hand. Croup was surprised at his condition, but the lieutenant wasn't. "Sir," the lieutenant said softly, "can I get you something?" "Another night's sleep." He rubbed his eyes, then clutched his right arm. Croup flinched at the motion. "Is it bothering you again? Hasn't done that since—" "It's fine, Leonard," Thorne snarled, then sighed penitently. "I'm sorry, Guide. Just a bad night." He glanced at the lieutenant and involuntarily shuddered. "Call me the back guard, Lek. We have some business this morning." "Yes, sir." He went to the back door and returned a moment later with the guard. "Well?" Thorne asked the soldiers. "General, none of our soldiers were detected. Captain Varys was seen leaving the forest with Sergeant Onus." "The forest?" The lieutenant couldn't help himself from interrupting. General Thorne smiled thinly. "History has proven that only the most traitorous criminals meet in the forest, Lek. We need no more evidence to convict them than that. Where did they go next, soldier?" "Captain Varys returned to his quarters, while Sergeant Onus went—" He hesitated. Thorne nodded once for him to continue. "Sergeant Onus was seen carrying a jug of mead to Miss Amory's. As of this morning, he still hadn't left. Probably because his duty shift doesn't begin until after midday meal today, sir." Thorne's thin smile continued. "Mead?" Croup gasped. "Was it mine?" The soldier shifted uncomfortably. "Unknown, sir." "My mead!" "Will be the last drink those two men will have, Guide Leonard," Thorne said sharply. The lieutenant paled. "Sir, what will their punishment be?" The general finally dared look him in the eyes. "They are the means for causing death to Edge, so their punishment will also be death." The lieutenant recoiled. "Sir, you can't do that. It's not proven. Couldn't they be incarcerated until evidence—" "I can't do that?" Thorne interrupted, repeating the words slowly to verify that the lieutenant had actually told him what to do. The lieutenant knew he'd gone too far, but in the back of his mind he remembered why he was still an Edge. To save lives. To save lives. Incarcerate them? For how long, Lek? How long should we feed the swine who tried to starve everyone else? Till they're old men? Crete, they're not worth the grain, Lek." A part of the lieutenant almost agreed. It did seem wrong to give them food when they were stealing it to sell, but nothing was proven yet. "Sir, you can't take their lives because of what might happen. How is that reasonable? Besides, Sergeant Onus has been my help in many ways." "He used you, Lieutenant Thorne," the general shouted, "to further his greed and his ambition. Can you understand that?" The world was all about using others for their own greed and ambition, and the most glaring example sat across from him, his bloodshot eyes staring back. "I'm beginning to understand, sir," he answered tightly. The general analyzed him, likely having heard his accusatory undertones. "We have no room for criminals, Lek. People will die during the next few weeks. Only those worthy and faithful should continue. Varys and Onus have both proven they are neither." "Faithful to what, sir?" the lieutenant asked boldly. "Faithful to me, Lek," the general shouted back. He turned to the guard. "I want both of them now, brought here. Tell the soldiers to break into Amory's house and pull Onus from her clutches if necessary. Now!" The soldier jumped and rushed from the room, and the general turned back to glare at his son. The lieutenant had no choice but to match it. He wasn't sure what the voice in the back of his head was saying, something about miscarriage of justice and arrogance of power, but he could feel its anger, and the lieutenant drew from that furious strength. He knew the staring match wasn't entirely his, but that he was channeling someone else's eyes. Thorn, on the receiving end of his glare, wilted ever so slightly. Professor Slither was at the door, shaking his head and tisk-tisking. "General, you can see how difficult my task has been. Since I've arrived, I've been trying to teach the lieutenant that it's not his task to question, but to accept. Sometimes he just can't hold his tongue. I blame it on an unfortunately inherited trait from his grandmother." "Indeed," the general seethed, ending the staring match which he was beginning to lose. Both of his grandparents enjoyed arguing, questioning, challenging, and look where it got them, Lek, dead. He leaned aggressively on the table, daring to meet his eyes again. "You were spared his fate, son, so don't you dare disgrace your grandfather. He could have been a great man, the greatest who ever lived, but he gave it all up and ruined his reputation. Don't you dare turn into him. Don't you dare try to destroy everything we're working so hard to create." The lieutenant followed most of his ranting, the words forming in his head, "There's nothing I want more than for him to turn into me," until Thorn spat out that last sentence, which made no sense to him at all. The lieutenant frowned. "Sir, I don't understand. What are we working to create?" "Just no!" Thorn roared at him, completely frazzled. "Don't understand. Just accept. Just learn to—" He spluttered in frustration. "Obey me!" Having never seen the general reduced to frothing, the lieutenant knew better than to say anything more than a meek, "Yes, sir." He'd learned at least that much in command school. "I've been watching Onus for a long time now," Thorn said, in a tone which tried to sound controlled but was barely steady. "When Captain Lick came from Sands, having delivered that fop of a General Yordan to his death, he recommended soldiers who would serve me well in his estimation. Now, I already knew Lick wasn't to be trusted. He betrayed one commander, so what was going to keep him from betraying another? It was obvious that any man he recommended would be equally as distrustful." Guy Lannard, who'd been cowering in his chair for the past few minutes, sat up taller. "So why'd you bring him to our fort if you knew you couldn't trust him?" he asked, insulted. Thorn sighed a growl. "Because if there's going to be any insurrection, I want it where I can see it unfolding. Crete Lannard, haven't you learned anything yet? When I took over the records from Sands, I could see there was a supply problem. Not surprisingly, the older Yordan either didn't notice it or didn't care to address it. And also, not surprisingly, as soon as Lick and Onus arrived, we began to have a supply problem as well." Croup sagged. "So it wasn't me?" Thorn glared at his new guide. "No, Lannard, it was not you. I put Major Yordan in charge of the supplies to see what happened with the numbers, and he began to cover up the losses successfully. When I sent him to Sands, I put you in charge to see if those who returned with him to his father's old fort were the same ones stealing from me. Since the losses continued here, I narrowed down the culprits to 4 of Yordan's former soldiers still here." Slither, who sat down at the table, was nodding in approval. Croup's lips were pursed, trying to follow the thread of the story. He'd soon be making a knot out of it, but would pretend otherwise. The lieutenant only stared at the general, realizing who really was at the heart of the supply problem. "Handing the supply lists over to you," the general continued, watching Lannard closely to see if he was following. Lannard seemed to be stuck in Sands. allowed for greater thievery since your idea of figuring is writing down random numbers until the page is full. I knew it wouldn't be too long before you asked for help. And Leonard, when you brought up the subject with various sergeants to find out who in their ranks was good with numbers, who was the most eager to offer assistance? Leonard blinked a few times. Well, no one wanted to get involved with the supply problem except for Sergeant Onus. He said he'd find someone to help me. He was beginning to comprehend what had happened. The lieutenant guessed that by dinner, Croup would be smacking his forehead. And how long after that did he provide you with a willing soldier? Thorne queried. The next day. And how closely did the sergeant watch that corporal? Well, once the corporal told him the extent of the problems, and Onus knew that even you had figured out there was loss, some covering up had to occur, Thorne said. And then you became spooked when my son reminded you of someone else? Leonard shrugged, turned pink, and looked down at the table. So then you handed the entire inventory procedure over to the corporal. Croup looked up. The sergeant said he'd watch him closely. It took another couple of seconds for him to recognize the mistake. Onus watched him closely. That's when the problems cleared up, didn't they? Thorne said coldly. Once Onus got a hold of the supply sheet, he knew what every number was supposed to be, and they could cover their tracks. That's also, I suspect, when the storehouses started to be filled with bags of dirt instead of wheat and corn. Ever since Deceit Blue, they've probably been busier than ever, and the sergeant and the captain are now the richest men in Edge. How long did you know? The lieutenant asked evenly, although his blood had been growing hot. Thorne's eyes flicked at him. All the time. Then why didn't you stop it? The lieutenant demanded, feeling the words flow from the back of his mind. So much has been lost. People are going to suffer because you failed to... How dare you? Thorne bellowed. How dare you suggest I've done nothing less than sacrifice all I have for this village, for the world. I've given my whole life, and even my right arm, to bring peace to this world. I couldn't stop the thievery because I didn't have enough evidence, nor did I know precisely who to stop. Even changing procedures as you did didn't stop it, did it now? Letting the thieves continue until they expose themselves through exposing you was the only way to put an end to the problem. The lieutenant's bravery must have come from the fury in the back of his head, from someone who once stole caravans of food for his village and didn't understand how a commander could idly let food be stolen away from it. But you claim that you knew all the time. Enough! Thorne shouted and pounded the table, rattling the dishes. Enough of your slagging arguments. You are to obey, boy, not to question, and certainly not to debate. Get the last of her out of you right now, or you'll never live long enough to become general yourself. Is that understood? The lieutenant was stunned silent, the words in his head stopping, likely knowing this battle couldn't be won today. I know what the real problem is, Thorne said, in an unnervingly calm tone. You finally realize you were manipulated. You trusted an authority figure, and now you understand he didn't care for you, but only for how you could further his purposes. You feel betrayed, don't you? The lieutenant narrowed his eyes, able to answer this one without any voices in his head. Oh yes, very much so, sir. The general squinted back. Then at least you've learned to not let it happen again. The lieutenant nodded once. The soldiers pounding on Miss Amory's front door sniggered. 2 were at the front, 2 more at the back, and 6 more positioned themselves around the house, watching the windows for anyone trying to escape. Another dozen were on their way to provide backup and also to watch the show. Sergeant Onus! A master sergeant shouted through the door. You've been requested to visit the general at the mansion immediately." The door flung open to reveal Miss Amory, dressed in a silk gown, her hair styled, her face precisely painted, as if she were going to a fancy dinner, even though it was barely time for breakfast. "There's no onus here," she declared with a saucy smile. "Are you sure the general wasn't requesting me?" The two soldiers pushed past her into the house. "No mention of you at all, ma'am. Sergeant Onus!" the master sergeant shouted. "We've been watching you all night. We know you're here, and that you came with a jug of mead. Do you need us to carry you out?" The soldiers laughed as they started up the stairs. "I told you!" Amory rushed after them. "No one's here." Several more soldiers now came in through the front door. "Search the house, men. He may be exhausted," called a staff sergeant, who winked at Amory. She scowled back at him and leaned against the wall of her gathering room, knowing it was only a matter of time. A moment later, a commotion was heard upstairs. "You have no right! How dare you! When I get back to the fort, I'll—" Onus couldn't finish his threat because of a fist that smashed into his mouth. Two soldiers dragged a bleeding Onus down the stairs. "We got him, men," called the master sergeant cheerfully, following them. "To the mansion." "Amory!" Onus garbled as he tried to wipe the blood, but the soldiers holding his arms wouldn't let him touch his mouth. He spat on the stairs instead. "Amory, help me! We have an agreement, remember? You and me, we can still do this. Think of what we can gain. Stand up for me, and we can turn all of this around." The soldiers let him stumble down the last stairs, then yanked him up again. Still, he tried to conduct business. "You don't know the way, remember?" he shouted at Amory, blood bubbling out of his mouth. "And he won't help you. I promise you that." "What's he blabbering about?" asked the staff sergeant, standing at the door as Onus struggled against his guards. Amory folded her arms. "I haven't understood a word he's said since he got here." "Amory!" Onus pleaded as the guards dragged him to the door. "Amory! Salem!" The master sergeant frowned at her. "Who's Salem?" She shrugged wearily. "Probably a dead dog. Who knows? He's been like this all night. I'm relieved you're taking him away. I think it was a bad jug of mead, and he drank it all himself. Just get him out of here." The staff sergeant tipped his cap. "As you wish, ma'am." "Amory!" Onus shouted one last time as they dragged him out the door. When the last of the laughing soldiers followed him out, she slammed the door and locked it. She slumped on the sofa, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Her biggest threat was now out the door and gone. Maybe. She nibbled on a fingernail. Who else knows? Who else might pound on the door in the middle of the night? Who else knows? General Thorne was waiting on the front steps, looking exhausted, furious, and all around terrifying. Behind him stood a reluctant Lieutenant Thorne, and next to him was a tense Major Croup, Guide Lannard. Major Twig had just joined them and held two official-looking pieces of parchment. Lining the long walk to the front stairs were 40 soldiers, 20 on each side, with their swords drawn. The lieutenant swallowed as he heard the shouts. Two clusters of soldiers were approaching the mansion, one from the fort, the other from the village. In the midst of each cluster of 25 men was a man shouting and screaming his innocence. The lieutenant's chin trembled when he recognized Sergeant Onus, his arms in chains and blood drooling from his mouth. "No, no, you've got it all wrong, no!" The lieutenant wondered how long he was expected to stand there. The general had said only, "Stand as a witness against them." But how much he was to witness, he didn't know. The two clusters were now closing in on the mansion and combined into one. Varys and Onus began to shout at each other. "What have you done to me?" "Me? You! This was all your idea." "How dare you! How dare you accuse me?" "Shut up!" Thorn roared at the men. The soldiers escorted the 2 men in shackles between the lines of soldiers and shoved them to their knees before Thorn. Onus peered around the general up to the lieutenant on the stairs. Shin, please, I never did anything against you. I know you can fix all of this. You know where." Thorn's boot in his face shut him up more effectively than anything else had that morning. The lieutenant flinched and shut his eyes as his former sergeant went face down into the gravel, more blood flowing from his face. "How dare you speak to my son that way?" Thorn snapped. "He is an officer and his name is Thorn. For your disrespect alone, you deserve to die." From the gravel, Onus whimpered, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry. Please, sir, just listen for 1 minute." "You used my boy," Thorn bellowed. "He wasn't your boy then," Onus sobbed. "He was always my boy, and now I have your confession. You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you? Varys, your confession, now." The captain stared in disgust at the sobbing, bloody Onus. "I've done nothing wrong, sir. You have no proof that I ever did." "Oh," Thorn sneered, "but I do. Right here." He reached behind him and grabbed Croup by the jacket. He pulled him down the stairs to his level. Croup's eyes were wide and worried. "Last night, Guide Lannard had a vision," Thorn announced, "and he saw Onus and you conspiring to decimate the food supplies of Edge for your own financial gain. He saw you in the forest, conversing and sharing a jug of mead. His jug of mead." Captain Varys's jaw dropped in dismay and shock. Before he could form an answer, Thorn said, "I take your stunned silence as an admission of guilt. That saves us the task of holding a hearing. Major Twig, read the declarations." Major Twig cleared his throat and read loudly from the parchment. "Captain Varys and Sergeant Onus are condemned this day, the 43rd day of harvest, to be executed for their crimes of gross disloyalty to General Thorn, the army of Idumea, and the citizens of Edge, with the intent to cause death to innocent men, women, and children." "No!" Onus cried. "No, that wasn't the intent, sir. Please, there's another way. I beg you, let me tell you of another way. No one needs to die. There's another way." "Lies!" General Thorn shouted. "Enough of lies! People will die because of you, Onus. When children are starving, their parents will tell them it's because of a smear of a man named Onus who sold away their food." "No, no, no!" Onus gasped. The lieutenant couldn't bear any more. "Sir, please, listen to the sergeant. Maybe he knows something." He didn't expect the hard slap across his face that nearly knocked him off the stair. Through the tearing of his eyes, he could make out the furious expression of General Thorn. "No one asked you for your opinion, boy," he snarled. The general spun around to Onus's pleading face. "I've heard enough from him. Squad, your blades are needed now." "Sir!" Onus screamed. But it was too late. The execution squad of 10 soldiers already plunged their blades into Onus. The lieutenant gasped in horror. Onus's lips moved, but no sound came out of them. But the lieutenant could make out Onus's last word. "Salem." Captain Varys stared in shock at what had happened to the sergeant, but he had little time to plead for his life. Within seconds, the execution squad had spun and plunged their swords into him, and Captain Varys, too, crumpled to the ground. The lieutenant felt he'd collapse as well, because they knew. Just like Captain Lick, they knew somehow. Salem was known to the army. He couldn't think more on that, because a strange sound reached his ears. It was cheering. The soldiers along the path were shouting, and soon were chanting, "General Thorn! General Thorn! Long live General Thorn!" The lieutenant's head pounded. 2 men lay dead at General Thorn's feet, and he was actually smiling about it. He held up his left fist in triumph. "Excellent work last night and this morning, men. You will all be amply rewarded. But praise for rooting out this terrible crime belongs to our great guide, Leonard Croup. The Creator revealed to him the plot and showed him the perpetrators. Already the Creator is providing for our deliverance from this terrible crisis. Long live Guide Leonard, the Creator's chosen!" The soldiers immediately took up the chant as General Thorne held up Guide Leonard's hand. "Long live Guide Leonard, the Creator's chosen!" The lieutenant was astounded. But even more astonishing was that he found his lips also forming the words, "Long live Guide Leonard, the Creator's chosen." And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.